Hello everyone, I'm Joey from Lock Props. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make Zoro's second blade, the Sandai Kitetsu. Now this is going to be part 1 since the painting for this blade took a lot longer than expected. Part 2 is going to be about me making the sheath here, so that's going to be coming in a later time. This blade is the cursed sword Zoro gets near the beginning of the series, and as soon as I saw it when I was like 11, I fell in love with the Hamone pattern, because in early 2000s, everything is cooler when it's a flame. Not to mention the backstory of this blade. It is doomed every wielder in the past, and Zoro decides to test it out by throwing it up in the air and sticks his arm out to see if the sword will cut him. But it dodges him without a scratch and decides to take it. Zoro has kept the sword longer than any other blade besides the Wado Ichimonji, which I made last time. If you want to check out that video, I recommend that you finish this one first and then head over and watch that one. So watch this video to its fullest.
Jesus Christ.
The tools, materials will be in affiliate links down below, as well as my Etsy template for purchase. It helps me make more of these videos by using those links, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Will I be the next cursed victim of this sword? Let's find out and get started.
We're going to go ahead and start off by printing out the 4 papers for the template. We'll cut off one side of the joining pieces, and then we'll overlay it on the other and then tape it down. Using the box cutter, I traced around the entire template and cut it out. You can cut out the sheath and the Tsuba if you want, but we won't be needing them at the moment. I'm going to go ahead and start off with the blade on this one, so I'll separate the blade section from the handle. We're going to be using 5mm EVA foam, and then we'll trace around the blade. We're going to be needing 2 sides, so I flipped the template over and traced it again. I take my same razor blade and I will cut on the outside line of the Sharpie. The reason why I go on the outside of the line is because when we glue everything together, we have some meat to kind of sand it down and make it all even. From the hardware store, I picked up a steel rod that was about 5mm thick, or about 3/16 inches. I'll lay it down on the foam and then trace around it with a Sharpie.
Again, to make this trench, you just use a razor blade. You'll cut out a 45-degree angle, but you don't want to go all the way through. That way you can cut out a piece of the foam, and that's where the rod is going to stay.
Recently, I love using this router for making out the trenches for my blades, so I'm going to go ahead and use it this time. As a reminder, you can use a Dremel attachment bit to turn your Dremel into a router, so then that way you can use that too. The depth of the router is around 2.5mm, so then that way when I sandwich them together, I won't see the rod in the middle of the body. I have one side of the trench done now, but I need to know where the rod is going to sit on the other side. So I'll take my heat gun and I'll heat the rod up enough so then that way when I press the other side of the foam into it, it will actually make an indent of where it should sit. I'll use my Sharpie to go down the line of the indent that I see, then I'll take the router and go all the way down to the end of the Sharpie line. Using good old barge cement, I put on 2 layers on each side and also on the rod. But where this detail is, I would probably recommend not to put barge where that's going to be because you're going to have to cut that out. Going slow, I start from one end and make sure that the trench is lined up as I'm going down. Easiest method is that I will bend the top piece upwards so then that way I can see where that trench is going to be and force it into place. You may have overlap like this, and that's okay because that's why we cut on the outside line of the Sharpie. Now for the really big excess pieces, we can start trimming this down with the razor blade. I recommend to trace around the entire blade, probably about 1mm thick, and then we'll go with the Dremel afterwards and really smooth everything out. To make this process a little bit faster, I went to my belt sander and I shaved down the edges that way. I only had to do a couple passes. Now we can go back to this piece. Remember, I said don't glue in this section right here, and you'll see why, because I ran into an issue, and you'll see that in a moment. So you'll cut the template out, and then you'll put it at the very end of the blade. You'll trace it with a Sharpie on one side, flip it around, and do the exact same thing. Using the razor blade, you'll go ahead and start slicing all the way around this piece. If you didn't glue it, you can easily just slide that off, but if you glued it like I did, then you'll have to work for it to get it off.
That's what she said!
Laying out the blade template again, we'll go ahead and take our X-Acto blade and cut all the way down the blade, for this section right here. This part in the anime and the manga seems like this part is a darker metal or black. I place the newly cut template back on the foam and trace it down with the Sharpie. Then I followed the line of the Sharpie with some masking tape. This piece of tape is going to protect the foam when we go to sand, which is why I layer it down with another strip. For this little curved piece, I laid the other piece of the template down and then I put the masking tape over it. Then, since I can see the outline of the template, I cut and trace around it using my X-Acto blade. For the sanding portion, you can use sandpaper, you can use a Dremel with a low grit, or if you're like me and you want to use your belt sander all the time, you can do that. I don't sand it to the point where it's paper thin, just enough so then that way you can actually see that there's a curve. Dust will be getting everywhere, so make sure that you wear your respirator and also vacuum as you go. To clean it up, you can use 220 grit sandpaper, then switch over to 320 grit sandpaper. But I'm a very lazy person, so I'll use 1000 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander. Power tools just make things so much easier. I used to be the person who would hand sand everything, but I would just spend too much time doing it. But use the tools that you have at your disposal. Just make sure that you're having fun. Now I get to peel off the masking tape and I can clearly see that there is a definitive edge on that blade. I slightly sand just a little bit of the edges on there just to round them over a little bit. Then I'll take the heat gun and I'll seal the foam. I'll take the decorative piece and put it right back onto the blade temporarily. And I'll put the template of the handle underneath so then that way I can see where I need to cut this rod in half. I just kind of eyeball where it's going to be. But I do make sure that the rod doesn't go to the very edge of the foam so then that way in case if it drops it doesn't jet out from the foam and then it's dangerous. I'll use this saw to cut it in half. I'm always trying to find an alternative to using metal in the middle of a blade. If anybody has any suggestions getting around this, please let me know in the comments. Definitely have to vacuum all the shavings of the metal. Going back to the decorative piece at the base of the blade, I want this to be thicker than the blade itself. So I grabbed some 2mm EVA foam and cut out a 1-inch strip. I put it on my glue/paint board and then I applied 2 coats of barge cement. I'll put the piece on the other side and do the same thing. When gluing these together, I want to make sure that I put the seam line at the bottom so then that way that doesn't get seen. Because you don't want to put it in the middle, otherwise it's going to be really hard to hide that. I get to a point where I see an overlap and then I'll use my razor blade to cut right where the seam line should be. I'll use my Dremel just to clean up the edges a little bit. If you really want to clean up that seam line, you can use some air dry foam clay and some water and put it into the seam and mix it all together. For the last sword, I forgot to do this. I want to cover the seam line of the back of the blade. So using the foam clay and some water, I went all the way on the back side of the blade. And now because of that extra 2mm foam, I can see the difference between that blade and that little piece. I really don't know what that part is called. But I do know the name of this. This is called the Tsuba. So now let's move on to this. Much like the sword, we'll go ahead and start cutting it out with an X-Acto blade. Using 6mm EVA foam as the base for the Tsuba, we'll go ahead and trace it around with our Sharpie. Again, we'll cut on the outside of that line. Using our Dremel, we'll go ahead and plunge it into the side so then that way we can get that round shape. If you are going to be doing this instead of using the X-Acto blade, please make sure to use a respirator because this will be burning the foam and that has terrible vapors. Of course, if you don't want to do this, use the X-Acto blade to cut this out. Using more 2mm EVA foam, we'll cut out 4 strips of EVA foam that are about 2 to 3 millimeters thick. I know I only showed 2 in the video, but I had to make 4 because I ran out. We'll do the 2 layers of barge, and we'll apply a thin amount to the edge of the Tsuba. To start this trim off, we'll go ahead and get to the very end of one of these pieces and cut at a 45-degree angle. We'll start at one of the sharp ends, and just take it one section at a time. As soon as you get to a curve, make a 45-degree cut on that side. For the next piece, you'll have an opposite 45-degree angle, so then that way you can continue the trim. And keep going around until it's complete. Don't forget there's another side. If you have some of this excess barge around here, you can use barge thinner or contact cement thinner on a Q-tip to clean that up. There we go, looks a little better. Now I'll go around the edge with my Dremel to even everything out. Using the foam clay and some water, we're going to go ahead and put it on the seam lines here, and then that way it'll clean it up just a little bit. Next, we're going to cut out this detail template from the Tsuba. We're going to lay the template over what we already have, and then we're going to mark it with our Sharpie. Do this on both sides. You remember those thin 2mm strips that we used for the outside layer? Most likely you'll have some extra left over, so you can use this as a detail piece. To make sure that they're all the same, I put the template right on top of the foam, and then I cut it out. I did this for 8 times. The detail has rounded edges, so I took my Dremel to each of the sides on each of the little pieces. Once they were finished, I grabbed some super glue and I tacked them into place. Last thing for the construction of the Tsuba is to make the hole in the center. Since I know that the rod is 3/16, I grabbed that drill bit and put it right in the center. Now we can seal these 3 pieces with Plasti-Dip. I did 3 layers of Plasti-Dip, but before spraying, I put it in some warm water for about 5 minutes. While they're drying out in the sun, I put the can back into the warm water again, so then that way it's constantly warm. Now on the blade only, I sprayed on 3 very light coats of the filler primer. We'll put the Tsuba away for now until we're ready to paint it. Once the filler primer was dry, I wet sanded it down with 400 grit sandpaper. Then I did the wet sanding again, but with 800 grit sandpaper this time. And then the third and final coat, I wet sanded it with 1000 grit. I noticed that it gets smoother and smoother every single time that you do a coat, and then also do a higher grit of sanding. But this time around, I did another layer of Plasti-Dip after I had sanded everything, and I did not expect this result. It is so much smoother now. I then sprayed it with some gloss black lacquer, and then followed it up with the clear lacquer. Really shiny. Because I'm worried about the finish being ruined by what's underneath it, I put down a brand new paper. Using the Tamiya 6mm masking tape, I found where the edge begins to taper down, and I start masking that area off, going all the way down the blade. Doing curves like this is a lot easier with thinner tape. After that was masked off, I grabbed the larger frog tape and masked off the rest. To start this paint job off, we'll go ahead and use our airbrush. I'm going to be using the All-Clad Dark Aluminum for the base. Since the anime kind of shows that it is like slightly a tint of blue or purple in this section right here, I added a little bit of the Candy Electric Blue to the Dark Aluminum. To be honest, I don't see it show up that much, so I would say skip this step. Unless you guys can see it, then I would say do it, but I personally don't see a difference. The key of having a shiny prop is to have a gloss black base, so then that way whatever you spray on top of it is also going to have a little bit of that shine coming through. We'll spray in light layers going all the way up the blade, and then I'll do one more coat afterwards. Now for the part that's going to hurt your back. This is going to be the template section of the Hamone. Before cutting out this template, I highly recommend to wrap the entire template with tape. Reason why is that the frog tape will tear up the template when you go to take it off, so you can reuse this. This happened to me on my previous video, so once I found that out, I used tape and it was easily able to peel off, and then I didn't have to reprint it entirely again. Now for the cutting out portion, I would highly recommend to have a brand new X-Acto blade. I had tried using one that I had sharpened multiple times, but the tip of it was basically just completely gone, and it made it a lot harder to cut this out. So I would say it might be time to just replace that blade on there. Also, as I was cutting this out, I realized that putting that paper underneath was a little bit too squishy or cushiony, and it made it harder to cut out the template. Eventually, you'll notice that I will switch over to my cutting mat, and that was a lot easier. So I would say don't even do the paper thing, just do the cutting mat. While cutting, don't be afraid to lift up the blade. Don't have it all just be one continuous cut. It's going to be impossible if you do that. The flame is also going to be jagged in certain areas, so it's okay if you go at it from one angle and then come at it from the opposite side. When we're ready to begin cutting it out of the masking tape, we'll lay it flat onto the cutting mat and then we'll tape it down like so. This is going to be great because it's not going to be able to move as you're cutting. So just be patient with it and just take it one cut at a time. When you think you're done, when you're peeling it back, be sure to do it very slowly. You don't want to have the masking tape just tear off into certain areas. Otherwise, when you look at the line won't be 100% clean. Now for the tricky part. I recommend to peel back the template from the masking tape as you're going. Don't take the template completely off, otherwise the small little curves that you just made are going to stick to themselves and then you won't be able to get them undone. I recommend to go slow and reposition yourself as you're going through this. The curve is not going to be 100%, but if you at least have tension of the masking tape while you're putting it down, you can actually control where it's going to go. At some point, I had to cut the masking tape at a section and then reposition it and then match it up to the area that it was going to be, because if I would have continued, it would have gone off the edge of the blade. Whew. Okay, so one side done. Once you have your wits about yourself, you can begin with the other side. So you flip the template over, you'll place the masking tape on top again, and then you'll do the exact same thing. Once done, make sure that you run over it with your finger so then that way it's all fully laid on the prop and nothing's sticking up. Now we're going to go back to the airbrush. Now, of course, if you don't have an airbrush, you can use spray paints instead of this. I just prefer the overall finish that the airbrush gives. But spray cans are going to be a great alternative. We're going to go up the blade with 2 light coats. I was really nervous about this part, so once I started peeling back and I saw that beautiful clean line, it was like a burden being lifted off of me.
Oh my God!
Now we need to seal that paint job, so I grabbed some Aqua Gloss Clear from Allclad and I sprayed it on. I have this little makeshift drying stand, so I put it there while it was curing. This is mainly going to be for part 2, and I would recommend that if you're going to make that sheath, do this now. After the blade had fully cured, I put it on 10mm EVA foam and I traced around it. We're going to leave this aside for the next video. So now we can work on the handle. We'll take the template and we'll cut off the piece of where the Tsuba is. We're going to put this template on 10mm EVA foam. We're going to trace it around on the Sharpie, and then when we're cutting it out, it's going to be on the outside line again. I always like to mark the middle, that way I know where the rod is going to go, but not to the end of the handle. I'll place the blade back onto the handle and then I'll mark where the rod stops. That's where I will stop with the router. Then I put 2 layers of barge contact cement onto them, but I do not put it in the trench yet. I'll grab the extra piece of the rod that I had cut off earlier and I'll put it here as a placeholder. This way when I go to sand, I have something to hold on to. I'll line up the trench with the edge and then I'll follow it all the way down. I'll use the razor blade to cut off the excess, and this also squares it off. This is optional, but you can cut at a 45-degree angle, so then that way you don't have to sand as much. Much like the blade, you can use sandpaper, you can use your Dremel, or you can use your belt sander. I would suggest when doing this, mainly just focusing on the corners of it, just to round it out. To make the handle more uniform and even, I grabbed my orbital sander and went around it with 1000 grit sandpaper. Next up, we'll grab this detail here. I first measured it with my calipers, which is about 4mm. Then on 2mm EVA foam, I measured out 4mm strip. For the middle piece here, we'll use our calipers to measure it out. I got about 36mm. So I measured out 36mm on the 2mm EVA foam. Then I cut it out. On the handle, I marked where that trim is supposed to go, and then I put barge cement in those areas. Taking the 2 trim pieces that we cut out already, we'll place it down and put barge cement on those too. Once semi-dry, I put the trim onto the handle. For the thinner piece of the trim that's up at the top of the handle, I cut out a 2mm strip. Since it's super thin, I use super glue for this. Once I have it overlapping, I'll cut it using my X-Acto blade and then press it into place. Same thing with the middle, we'll start from one side and wrap all the way around until we overlap, then we'll cut and put it into place. Now for the layer that's going to go on top of the trim that's in the middle. If we measure 36 millimeters, then we're going to measure 32 millimeters. We'll use barge cement around that section, but I make sure that I don't do it entirely to the edges because that's going to be seen and I don't want to get barge in those areas. I overlapped it and then I cut where the seam line should meet up. Now we'll clean up this section by using the Dremel, and you can also use the air dry clay and water to clean this up. Now for the pommel of the handle. We'll cut that piece out and trace it onto 6mm EVA foam twice. I'm using the thickness of the Sharpie to add an extra area to the pommel, that way we can have extra foam left over to sand down and make it more round. This is only going to be for the outside portion, not for the inside curved. Then we'll cut on the outside line. I place the template on the handle and I Sharpie where it's supposed to go. And then I mark relatively where the middle of it is. We'll go ahead and barge all sides with 2 layers. Using that 6mm EVA foam, I actually had a 1-inch strip already. Then we'll barge this side too. This is going to be the middle of the pommel. Once semi-dry, I'll go ahead and place the 2 sides of the pommel on there. I measured the inside portion. You should still do this because yours might be a little different than mine, but I did measure 20 millimeters, which makes sense because we used 2 10mm sides. I measured 20 millimeters out of that strip and then I cut it out. I put the cement on the side edges too, just to prep them. Starting from one edge, we'll go ahead and connect it and follow it all the way around. Once we get to the end, we'll cut out where it ends. For this next step, if you're using a Dremel, I would recommend to go with a low grit first, then switch out to a high grit. With the low grit, you'll be able to shape it down very quickly, and then you switch over to the higher grit to really smooth everything out. But if you know me, I just use my belt sander. By the way, I do have 2 different belts for my sander. I have a 80 grit and then I have a 1000 grit. So imagine I just got done with the low grit sanding drum. Now we just switch over to the high grit sanding drum. Then we'll use the air dry foam clay and some water to smooth everything out. Next we got to make this little hook detail on the pommel. I used a drill bit that was about the size of the circle on the side of the template. Make sure that when you are drilling this out, make sure that you are completely even, otherwise one side will be off center. Now we'll go plasti dip it 3 times. I had an extra piece of a carbon fiber rod that was thinner than the hole. I slipped it through to the other side and then I marked it with my Sharpie and then I cut it off. You want to make sure that there's a little bit of extra on the sides so then that way it can easily move. Using our 6mm foam, we'll cut out a 6mm strip. I have this easy hole punch, so I use this to cut out the hole for the rod, but if you don't have this, just use a drill. I'll put some super glue into the hole and place the carbon fiber rod in there to let it cure. Do this for only one side for now. I had this copper pipe that was about 15 millimeters, and I punched a hole in the 6mm foam. I made 2 of these. I grabbed these little nubbins, yeah. I put them on a pair of tweezers and I sanded it down with my Dremel. On the side of the rod that we had already glued, we'll place some glue right on top of the rod, then we'll place the nubbin and put it right on top of that. And then I sanded it down to make it look more even. Now that one side is glued, I slot it through to the other side, and then I kind of guesstimate how long I want this to be. I press the foam into the rod so then that way it makes an indent in the foam, and then I punch the hole out. We'll cut off the excess strap and then we'll Dremel down the corners. We'll glue the nubbin on the other side. Looks good. At this point I took it outside to plasti dip it. Now here's the fun part. We'll take the Rub and Buff gold leaf and then we'll start painting it onto the trim that are going to be gold. You can go as heavy as you want or as little as you want. The less paint that you do will leave a lot more black, which kind of makes it a little bit more antique or rustic. I forgot to do this at first, but I do recommend putting frog tape over everything that's not supposed to be gold, just in case if you accidentally slip. Because once Rub and Buff gets onto something, it does not want to come off. So the parts of the handle that are going to be gold are going to be the pommel, the middle piece, the top trim, and also the Tsuba, and the little keychain hook thing at the end of the pommel. Also, you want to paint the hook first before gluing it into place. That way the underneath is going to be fully gold in case if you can't reach it. We'll put some super glue into the hole, then we'll thread it through and then cap it off and it'll be glued. Looking good. But since we have the rub and buff out right now, we'll go ahead and paint the Tsuba. I really like the way that the gold turned out on the Tsuba. For some reason, it's got so much texture to it. It's awesome. Oh, what also needs to be gold is the bottom trim of the blade. I didn't like the first design of my handle, so I redid it again with a lot more strap detail. So I printed it out and cut it out again. With my calipers, I measured 4mm for the strapping. Using 2mm EVA foam, we'll cut out 8 strips that are 4mm thick. Once they're all cut out, we'll plasti dip them 3 times. So I laid out all of the strips to paint, and for some reason I thought that the strapping was gray. It's not, it's a very dark red.
You what?
Some scenes in the anime looks like it's gray, but in most other scenes it's dark red. So when you see gray here, I actually mean dark red. So from here on out, just learn from my mistake and just paint it red before gluing it on. With these strips, we'll cut at a severe angle just to start it off. That way it becomes more flush with the top of the trim. Then we'll use super glue to put it in place and then start wrapping it around. I always recommend to add a drop of super glue throughout it, just so then that way it doesn't completely unravel. Once we get to the bottom, I'll mark it with my nail. Gross, I know. And then I'll cut at that angle. Then with the next strip, you'll cut at the opposite angle because you're going to be going in the opposite direction. Make sure that when you're crossing over, the cross is in the middle of the handle. At that cross, that's where I add the drop of super glue. I'll make that mark again once I get to the bottom and then I'll super glue it. When I got to this point, it seemed a little barren, so I decided to do more handle wrapping. Because one side looks good, but the other side has some really big spaces in there. So we just make 2 more strips that go in the opposite direction that the other set did. And repeat the process. Then we're going to basically do the exact same thing with the bottom part. And there we go. Looks great. So since Zoro has been in a lot of sword battles, I don't expect this handle to be very clean. What we can do to weather it a little bit is we'll use Liquitex Mars Black and use some water to thin it down to make a wash. We'll brush it all around the crevices and creases of this handle and then try and wipe it off as best we can. Now we have the dark layer down, we'll go ahead and now use raw sienna and make a wash out of that too. When doing weathering, you want to go from darker colors to lighter colors. It's subtle, but it's there. So that weathering I would recommend after you have painted it all red. This is the part where I had to fix my problem. So I did the Mars Black and then cadmium red and mixed it together to make a dark red. Using a thin flat brush, I slowly go around the entire handle. But if you paint this red from the start, then you don't have to do that painstaking process of going slow and meticulously painting each ribbon carefully. Now we can build it! We'll put super glue into the base trim of the blade and then slide it on. Then we'll put super glue onto the rod and on the back piece of the blade trim. You don't want to add too much super glue because then it will spill onto the Tsuba and it will leave a mark. For the handle piece, I have to put a lot of super glue because the rod has to travel a pretty far distance down the hole. So yeah, we're gonna make sure that it's all lubed up. I have no other way of describing that. I am so sorry. But at least it won't move once it's dried. And there you have Sandai Kitetsu.
I think that this has become my favorite katana that I have made so far. The way the Hamone came out is just, love it. Please let me know what you thought in the comments down below, and if you're going to be trying to attempt to make this accursed blade. If you got value out of this, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to see how I made the sheath for this, when that video goes live, I'll put it right here so then that way you can click it now. Will you choose me, Blade?